If you could pull out your handout on the Lord's Supper, before we get into how each view is different from the others, I'd like to cover what they have in common and also some introductory issues. So first of all, the names of the Lord's Supper. Number one, it's called, surprise, the Lord's Supper. Also called communion, because there's 1 Corinthians 10, one loaf, and so we form one body. Eucharist, Mark 14, 1 Corinthians 10, because in Mark 14, Jesus gave thanks when he broke the bread and passed the cup, and it's also called the cup of thanksgiving in 1 Corinthians 10. Also called the Mass, and that word comes from the last word of the Roman Catholic liturgy, the word massa, or missa. Missa means go. So it's called the Mass because it means we're done, scram, a little more formal. Agape meal, because we think in Jude and 2 Peter, this love feast that the early church was having, that this is included in that is the Lord's Supper. So those are the words that are being used. In general, in the book of Acts, you have these disciples of Christ who were missing their Savior, their leader. He had just been with them not that long ago. And so as they met each week to have church and to pray and study the Word, they also would punctuate a common meal they would share. They would punctuate it with the bread and the cup, and this bread and cup would symbolize and represent the presence of their recently departed Lord, as if he was right there with him. A good book on this is I. Howard Marshall, Last Supper and Lord's Supper. It's old, but it's still very good. Some key biblical text on this. Of course, Jesus inaugurates the Lord's Supper, and a key text there is, this is my body, this is my blood. Many Christians have taken this quite literally. In fact, the Lutheran view in your book on page 93 says, third line from the top, in instituting the sacrament, Jesus sat with his disciples who received him in bread and wine, and in the same moment was present wherever God was. So Jesus sat with his disciples who received him in bread and wine. So in some sense, Jesus is right there with them, and he's also somehow in the bread and in the wine that they're receiving. So the Lutheran view is, this is my body, this is my blood. That's literal. In fact, this is one of the key sticking points that divided Luther from Zwingli. And Zwingli was in Zurich, the Swiss Reformed, and Luther was in Wittenberg, the German Lutherans, and they were wondering if they could unite forces, unite armies to fight the Holy Roman Emperor and his Roman Catholicism. But again, this is a throwback before our contemporary secular days, and they said, well, we can't unite our armies if we're not united theologically. So they had a meeting, Luther and Zwingli, at Marburg, and they agreed on most things except this Lord's Supper. The legend is that Luther had written on the table, Hoc est corpus meum, in Latin, this is my body, and had covered it with a napkin. And at a crucial moment in their debate, Luther took off the napkin and said, Zwingli, it says, this is my body. What part of that don't you understand? And Zwingli said, well, actually, Jesus didn't speak Latin. He spoke Aramaic, and Aramaic doesn't have the word is. There's no copulative verb. So Jesus would have just said, this my body. And you're reading it as this is my body. It could have meant this represents my body. There's another guy, Karlstadt, who was kind of one of Luther's former friends, who then they had a big falling out, and Karlstadt was more popular with the Anabaptists later and the radicals. But Karlstadt read, here's how he read that. Jesus was pointing at himself. This is my body, which probably not. But all to say that this statement, this is my body, this is my blood, in the 16th century, it prevented Luther and Zwingli from uniting theologically and uniting then militarily, even at great risk of their own lives. So this can't overstate just how important this was in the 1500s. How is Jesus present, and is he present in the Lord's Supper? I do note here that Luke 22, verse 20 says, Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood," which would seem to imply this is symbolic. He doesn't mean for us to take it that literally. Which brings us to letter B in John 6. Jesus says very clearly, "I am the bread of life. You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood." And I like what on page 139, Russell Moore says to the Roman Catholic view, that I think you are making the same mistake as Jesus' overly literalistic Jewish audience. They were grossed out and said, "Well, I'm not going to eat your flesh and drink your blood. That's ridiculous." And they left and they went away. And Russell Moore says, "I think you Roman Catholics are making a similar mistake today." But Jesus clearly didn't mean you have to take a bite out of his arm or cut him and drink his blood. He meant it spiritually, metaphorically. Other key text, letter C, places where the church celebrates the Lord's Supper. Most of them talk about breaking bread in homes, but we think that breaking bread, again, would have included this, their eating together would have been punctuated by the bread and the cup representing the recently departed Lord. So breaking bread is more than just having a meal together. It is that, but it also, we think, was the Lord's Supper. On page 2 of your handout, just a comparison overview. Before we talk about how they are different, all the views in this book, they did have some things in common. First, they all agreed that baptism is a prerequisite for the Lord's Supper, that you don't eat before you're born, and so it's wrong to take the Lord's Supper unless you've been baptized. The Lutheran, on page 50, he takes a run at the Baptist who would hold the Zwinglian position that this is just a memorial, a remembrance, and he says something that, what do you think about this? On page 50, about two-thirds of the way down the page, he says, "For Zwingli, God was not present in their rites and its elements, hence they were not essential for salvation. It's hard to avoid the implication that one sacramental sign can be substituted for the other, and that the order of their administration is a matter of indifference. Today's Baptists, like Zwingli, regard both rites as memorials, signs, and proclamations, making baptism's function virtually indistinguishable from that of the Lord's Supper. Thus, within the Zwinglian context, it's not surprising that the Lord's Supper can be given to one without baptism." His point is, if baptism and the Lord's Supper are really just about us expressing our faith, then they basically mean the same thing. And why would it matter then that you do one before the other? So I think he's right. I think that's a telling point against the typical Baptistic, low church, evangelical Zwinglian view. And we get into trouble. We end up in this spot when we say God is not doing anything in baptism or the Lord's Supper. These things are just opportunities for us to express our faith. But aren't we already doing that when we come to church and when we sing songs and pray? But everyone in the book agrees that baptism must be done first. In fact, I like what Tim Keller says in his church, because there's the risk here is that you might be off-putting, right? You might make people feel badly if they haven't been baptized, that they can't take the Lord's Supper. So what Tim Keller says, as the elements are passed, he says this is for baptized believers, and if you're not a baptized believer, don't take the bread and the cup, but take Jesus instead. And then after we're done, come forward and tell us what you've done, and we'll make sure to prepare you so that by next time you can take the Lord's Supper with us. And I've used that in church too, and I think that's a very kind, non-threatening, it's a loving way to tell people this is special. It's not for everyone, but we don't want to exclude you. We want you to participate. We just want you to be prepared and ready. So, number one, they all agree in the book that you must be baptized first. They also think it should be celebrated often. It seems that they all want it done, or most all want it done weekly, but they're willing to settle for at least monthly. Monthly seems to be the bare minimum. but most would want it even more than just once a month, but every week. Uh, Calvin himself in Geneva wanted it every week, and then had to celebrate for once a month because of he wasn't actually in charge of Geneva. There were magistrates who he had to persuade, and he couldn't convince them. And for Roman Catholics, to be a practicing Roman Catholic, you must take the Lord's Supper at least once a year, and typically that's on Easter. If you're a devout Catholic, you take the Lord's Supper every single day. So devout Catholics go to Mass every single day. A practicing Catholic goes once a year, and then a lapsed Catholic doesn't go once a year. So I myself would love to have the Lord's Supper every single week. I think it's important, and it shouldn't just be an add-on to a service once a month. But that's my view. But I also am trying to lead my church slowly and not force it upon them. But as we do the Lord's Supper, to make a big deal out of it and try to impress upon them why this matters, and hopefully whet their appetite to want it more. Thirdly, they all think that the Lord's Supper is a sacrament or an ordinance of the church, which means it's not just for any small group of Christians. Now, Hesselink, the Western Seminary professor, the Reformed view, he seems open to parachurch celebration of the Lord's Supper on page 71, but he doesn't seem too excited for it. Scaer the Lutheran criticizes Baptists for being too loosey-goosey with the Lord's Supper. Roman Catholics believe you can celebrate the Lord's Supper anywhere as long as there are clergy present on page 132, because clergy are what they are the church. So if a clergy is present, if a priest is there, then that is the church. It's true that on page 68 and 69, Hesselink mentions that at Western Seminary, they have the Lord's Supper every Friday in chapel, but Western Seminary is part of the RCA Church, and so you could make the argument that is still the church taking the Lord's Supper together. Our seminary is very clearly, we're not part of the church. We're a parachurch organization, so it wouldn't be quite the same thing for us to take the Lord's Supper in our chapels. So this idea that the Lord's Supper should only be done, it's a church ordinance or sacrament, it does raise questions for, again, a lot of us low church evangelicals, where we're tempted to take the Lord's Supper because it's meaningful and it's moving. So Chuck Swindoll, a preacher once, one of my favorite preachers, but he said once that he and his friends were out at the beach and they had potato chips and soda pop, and they used those to have the Lord's Supper. That would have driven the Lutheran and the Reformed and the Roman Catholic nuts. You can't replace the bread and the cup with potato chips and pop. And also, you're not a church. You're just a group of friends. Save it for the church. Also, this would raise questions about in a wedding. Often in a wedding, the bride and groom will take the Lord's Supper as a way of starting out their new lives together, and I know it's so deeply meaningful. But one pushback is, but you're not a church. This is a wedding, and not. If you're going to take the Lord's Supper, it's about communion, and it actually could be construed as unloving for just the two of you to take it, or just you and the bridal party to take it. Shouldn't you be sharing with the rest of us? Why are we just watching you take the Lord's Supper? So, again, we can talk about this in class. I'm sure it's controversial, but something to think about. As far as a seminary chapel or a college chapel, I know that's controversial too. One thing you could do is, instead of taking the Lord's Supper, because that's a church ordinance or sacrament, you could substitute foot washing, so that you're still showing that we're unified in the community that we have, but it's lesser than what could be a church sacrament or ordinance. But we can talk about this in class. I'd like to hear what you think. Fourth, they all also agree it's a communal or corporate observance, that It's not just an individualistic thing. Russell Moore talks about we should have a common loaf and a common cup. And he says if that grosses you out, well, then that's just too bad. I'm not sure I'll go that far, especially if someone else has drunk out of it before me. I'm not crazy about the backwash, but I think he's right that it is. It's not just it's personal, but it's not individualistic. It's a communal, corporate observance. And just think about how he's got a funny way of describing how the way we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we call it a supper. But how odd is this? Think about this. We Americans, pound for pound, are the largest creatures God ever made. We have Big Macs and footlongs. We invented the buffet. We supersize things. But when it comes to the Lord's Supper, we say, give me the smallest little wafer pellet I can fit in my little grubby hands and just a shot glass of juice. It's almost comical, right? We have the smallest bit of food and we call it a meal. Like, when is the Lord's Supper not a supper? When is a supper not a supper? When it's the Lord's Supper. So it is odd that we have this kind of privatized, individualistic, and really kind of pathetic way of observing the Lord's Supper. And number 5, they all say that wine is at least permissible, if not mandatory. On page 84 and 94, the Lutheran says that if it's not wine, it doesn't count. And Russell Moore the Baptist has a good rejoinder on page 104, but the Roman Catholic and the Lutheran say it must be genuine wine and unleavened bread, or it's not the real thing. So that is strange for a lot of evangelical ears to hear, but they're saying you can't just get jiggy with the Lord's Supper. You just can't improvise and do whatever. Jesus instituted these elements. Sometimes it gets really kind of overly divisive. In the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, there was a recent debate over what's called the intincture method. Intincture is where you dip the bread in the wine. And some were saying it was very clear that Jesus didn't do that Jesus passed the bread and then passed the cup. And so if you do intincture, you are adding to the text. You're doing an extra biblical way of taking the Lord's Supper, and that's just wrong. That seems overly legalistic to me, overly divisive, but sometimes you hear that. So we want to be biblical about how we take the Lord's Supper, and I think the closest we can get to wine. It's a problem, of course, in these days with recovering alcoholics. So that was raised as well to the Lutheran, and he said, well, use wine with a lesser alcoholic content. Yeah, but if someone really is a recovering alcoholic and they clearly cannot have a sip without relapsing or risking relapsing, it's not wise and not loving to demand wine in the Lord's Supper. But it wouldn't be wrong to give the option of wine, for sure. But probably, grape juice, it's as close as we can get to wine without risking relapse for former alcoholics. And then, so the point is the elements count, right? You want to have bread, you want to have wine. Don't just substitute potato chips and pop. Diet Coke, that's seems to trivialize the Lord's Supper. Lastly, in the 16th century, here's a few points in which all the Protestants were in agreement against the Roman Catholic Mass. First of all, they thought the Roman Catholic Mass was a Eucharistic sacrifice, which became a form of works righteousness. So Luther thought he was fighting a two-front war. He said, on the one hand, I'm fighting Zwingli, who thinks the Lord's Supper is just a memorial. But if it's just a memorial, that means it's something I'm doing, and that means it's a human act, and that means it's works righteousness. I'm doing this. It's works righteousness. But the Roman Catholics are saying the bread and the wine are turning into Jesus, and they're re-sacrificing him. And what could that be but another form of works righteousness? So Luther was fighting a two-front war against works righteousness. And he thought the answer was the bread stays bread, the wine stays wine, but Jesus is really present. The point is, even Zwingli and Luther, they could agree that the Roman Catholics are wrong. they're re-sacrificing Christ. Now we'll see in the next lecture that Roman Catholics today are more clear that that's not what they're doing. But in the 16th century, that's what the Protestants thought it was clear. And the Roman Catholics were not clear either. It seemed that they were re-sacrificing Christ. Secondly, all the Protestants are opposed to transubstantiation, which means the substance of the bread and the wine, they change. So the accidents, the properties of the bread, the properties of the wine, it's white, it's flaky, it's red, it's moist, it tastes like wine, it tastes like bread. The accidents stay the same, but the essence or the substance changes. When the priest says the magic words, hoc est corpus meum, and by the way, that's where we get the word hocus pocus from, right? When the priest says, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, something magical happens, right? The altar boys ring the bells, and at that moment, the bread and the wine turn into Jesus' body and blood. And Luther thought that was making Jesus captive to Aristotelian philosophy, because Aristotle invented this substance-accidents distinction, and you're just becoming you're overthinking it. You're being way too rational. Jesus is present, but let's not try and be that clarify how he's present. Also, for Zwingli, if the bread and wine do not actually turn into Jesus, then there's no Jesus present to sacrifice, and so he would be against it as well. Third, ex opere operato. This is the idea that by the work it has worked. Just show up. You don't have to have faith. Just don't block, and the grace in the Lord's Supper will grace you. Will do its work. Will save you. And all the Protestants disagree with that. You have to have faith, or it doesn't work. It doesn't save you. Number 4, clericalization. This is the idea that the Lord's Supper in the 16th century was a spectator sport. If you're a lay person, you come and you watch. You watch the bread and the wine turn into Jesus, and you watch the priest eat the bread and drink the wine. But you don't get to participate. You only get the bread once a year on Easter, and they never trust you with the wine, because what if you drop it? And the wine, the blood of Christ, will then seep into the ground. So you only ever get the bread and just once a year. But for the average peasant, this was like having their quiet time. This was a deeply spiritual experience, because they thought they were seeing Jesus. And when the event was over, the priest would have to drink the blood, because you don't want to risk that. But you would put the bread, the body of Christ, in this glass box called a monstrance. And the average Christian could file past and look and think they're looking at the body of Jesus. And sometimes they would put that bread on a pole and march it through town, and it'd be a parade, the Corpus Christi parade, the Body of Christ parade. And the Protestants look too much like idolatry. They were opposed to that. 5, they also thought it's unloving to just give the laity one kind, the bread. If this is really what you say it is, and this is Christ and our communion with him, give them the whole Christ. They also were against having the liturgy just in Latin. Now, they had Latin masses, but Luther also wrote the Mass in German. He said that the Germans should have their own Mass in their own style. They kept the Latin Mass because whenever you traveled, if you're German, Spanish, French, if you knew the Latin Mass, you could go anywhere and participate in church. So they kept that, but also Luther wanted a German-style Mass for the German people. And part of what he did was write German music. And like, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And Luther said, the old people refused to sing it. They sat there like blocks, like one of these newfangled worship songs. We're not singing it. So if you're a worship leader, take heart. A Mighty Fortress panned when it first came out. And then commercialization, this is where the Mass became, in the 16th century, kind of a good luck charm. If you were having, if you had a wedding, certainly a funeral, if there was bad weather coming, or if you wanted your cows to deliver a calf safely, you might call for the priest and have them pay them money, and they'll do a private Mass for you. And again, in Wittenberg, 2 years after Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the castle church door, in 1519, there were 9,000 private Masses performed in his castle church. So this did not go away overnight. And yet, on all of these issues, the Protestants were united against the Roman Catholic Church. So next lecture we'll talk about each one individually and what they bring to the table. Hear that? What they bring to the Lord's table.